At this point, I think we do need to look at our options, but I don't think we need to be jumping into anything too quick. I have a little faith in our policy, our facilities committee, and I'd like to hear what they have to say after they do some examination. I guess I'll have a little more to say about that when we get to the demographic, the next section.
You know, one thing I'd like to reinforce at this point as well is that there are advocates of all models, if you will, whatever the configuration preference might be. And I don't disagree that anyone can find whatever those benefits are to the exclusion of the benefits of an opposing model or a different model. And yes, everyone likes what we may be doing currently, and change is always difficult. But again, what I'm suggesting we consider here for the long view is, as leaders in the community, looking at what's coming down the road and what we can continue to afford. And our district is very different than our cohort districts and much more heavily funded on a per student basis. And it's just because we have more buildings than they do. That's what the data says. So we're going to find ourselves at some point of having to choose between buildings and funding student improvements in student outcome. Something we can not continue to afford with the current model that those who are getting good results with may just not be able to continue to burden the taxpayer with. We do hear from those that feel very strongly about that. I'll grant you, those people are willing to show up. We also have to consider that the population we represent is about 10,000 strong throughout the district. And we need to give the rest of the population a chance to hear all sides of the argument and then come to a conclusion in our democratic way. So if we have exhausted the discussion on this at this point, I'd like to move on, but I want to ask if there's any further commentary from anyone on the board or here at our table. Before we take action on that, again, I want to hear from public comment. If we take action. Duly noted that there's some time here for us to move forward and see how this evolves. Without objection, I'd like to move on to item 7B, which is a report from the Town of Hill Subcommittee.
Excuse me, did you want to comment on this one?
Not from the public just yet.
Thank you.
John, I'm sorry. Can we hear from the Hill Subcommittee?
You can hear from me.
And you have the floor.
I guess to start the discussion, we had obviously previously met, reviewed an RFP, which was placed in front of this board, and it was voted to send Hill a proposal to provide them a tuition agreement for their 6th through 12, or 2nd through 12th grade students. That proposal included a tuition calculator that was specifically approved by the board and sent to them. This past week we met with delegates from the Hill School Board and their administrative staff to review that calculator and the numbers and start to develop what a tuition rate would look like as they move forward to bring a number and a decision back to their board and ultimately their voters. Through that discussion, we identified that the number that we presented them based on the Hill calculator that was approved by the board initially was just significantly higher than the competing school districts, the other school districts that provided them with tuition numbers. But we also, as a subcommittee, then looked back at why is that number so high, and what are some of the charges, what are some of the costs that are within our budget that would not affect the education of the Hill students coming in and would otherwise be paid for. So as an example, we had approved to take transportation out because Hill was going to provide transportation. Well, there's other costs such as one-on-one aids that are specific to this district that should those students require that service would be paid for by the town of Hill in that funding. So the business administrator is handing out basically a new calculator that we're going to bring forth tonight. It says these are those items that we've identified that we can remove from building the tuition rate and provide not only the Hill School District with a number that is perhaps more reasonable and more financially, that they're more capable of actually contracting for that tuition with, but that is really a true representation on the cost per pupil of what we're providing to them, and it also includes some numbers, or it doesn't, because it's not on.
I have a second page.
And then there were some additional numbers to really show how this reflects against the actual cost per pupil to the remaining districts. So this is fairly fair. I think the Ruby Hill's the chair of the Hill subcommittee, but she's obviously not here because she's ill. Most of these items she had discussed previously in our meeting the other day. Dawn and I and the administration met to look at this calculator and really feel that this is building a good number to move forward, and we'll be asking to present this tuition calculator to the Hill board. And I would, that's about all I got to say that would sound intelligent.
Many of the description items there are ones that we will actually be billing for. So like if they have a student that requires a one-on-one aid, then we would bill the cost of that aid to Hill, and they would be reimbursing us. So that's why we subtracted out all our one-on-one aids that we're providing to our current students. And the second page is looking at it from a revenue quote tax basis. And for those that have a copy of that, if you look at the cost, total tax education cost per student, that came out to close to the same amount that the formula that we're proposing be approved. So it's proof that this is a fair tuition basis as compared to what each, all the towns are paying for our current students.
I have a question. It appears that you're subtracting out school board budget items. Does the school board not run the district? And should that cost not be borne by all members of the district?
Well, they aren't members, they don't have a voice.
But they still...
And they have their own school board expenses.
Right, but they still would be sending students to our district, and those,
Boys,
but they
Yeah.
still,
and they have their own school board expenses.
right, but they still would be sending students to our district, and those costs should be borne by every child that's going to school, based on the way we fund our school. It is not fair to the other communities who have to pay a portion of the cost of running the SAU office because they send students here to allow someone from out of the district not to share that cost. Now, I understand the one-on-one aids and I understand the busing, but I have a problem with them being left out of items that everybody in the district has to pay. And then they would get out of it just because they aren't a member of the SAU, I don't think is right. I can't support that.
That is, feedback that we can take into consideration.
You know, the operating of the superintendent's office, I mean, that's a cost for running the district, for running the buildings that they will be taking advantage of using.
But it would also, if I can add though, at some level I agree, but I don't. So the superintendent services really cover me, the facilities, I mean, they're not buying into the district. At some point they talked about potentially, but they're not looking to buy into the district. These are really the services for us to run the district. They would, so for me to do the count, they would still be getting those services from Franklin and Hill. They're not withdrawing from the SAU. So SAU services would still come through Franklin and Hill for them.
All right, so let me ask a question.
It's like taxation without representation.
But let me ask a question, okay? If one of their students gets in trouble, and the parent wants to appeal the principal's decision, where do they go?
Hill and Franklin. If they're gonna expel a student, it would go through the Hill and Franklin School Board. This board would not have the authority to do that. It would have to go through their board. You could certainly have some say with it.
So our superintendent's office would not make any decision.
It's an interesting setup. And that's one of those interesting pieces when you're gonna leave a school district but not leave an SAU.
See, I think that the SAU office superintendent is running the business of the district, and I think that all the fees and expenses should be shared by everybody who goes. I mean, that's just, that isn't based on where you are, it's what you're using. I have a problem with that coming out of there.
Anyone else?
Another argument about those services is that cost, whether the 60 students come here or not, is going to remain the same. In
All?
other words, there's no additional cost that they're adding to us.
But all of our costs are going to remain the same if they don't come.
Yeah, that's the sunk cost argument that I have a problem with.
But the one-on-one aides, as an example, they're going to be billed for any of those services.
And I'm fine with that. I see summer school programs on here. Are they not going to send their students to our summer schools?
We would bill them for those services
Bill them.
individually.
So, Jeff, this
See,
is,
excuse me, Mike, see, the problem I have with this is that the administration of a program like this over a 10-year period is what makes me not want to be in favor of it fundamentally. For speaking from the beginning, the fundamental cost differential, good work on the stats to show that it's all fair. The problem I have with it is equivalent to or analogous to our Project Promise situation, where we're not done with that yet, and we've had to pay back $144,000 and may have to deal with another $100,000 worth of personnel issues and payments. But that was something that was more easily administered. And when you get into the questions that you just raised, Jeff, And Stacy noted that when they decide they may want to leave the district and tuition out, then it becomes questionable. That's what I have a problem with, all these gray areas that we're going to get ourselves into, and then over a 10-year period, which is what this agreement is for, or would be for, we would have very likely several boards and maybe 2 or 3 administrations. And the makeup of those may not be as competent as we have now to administer these things. And so trying to keep this thing straight over that period of time equates in my mind to big education and scope creep. And that's why I'm opposed to this. I would be very much in favor of Hill joining the district and being a full-fledged member of the cooperative district. Bring their school to us, bring their resources to us and their taxpayers. Then everything's on an equal footing. That's my feeling.
I see some of this being a billing nightmare.
Well, that's where I'm.
And, you know, I'm looking at after-school programs. I would assume that we're not excluding them from after-school programs. So,
But they would pay the same as what everybody else pays.
but we
Which
would
we
have to
bill
bill
for.
them for that.
We do bill for it.
Ben?
I guess what I would add, and I think momentarily, I think probably that section of school board services and superintendent services is probably the grayest, I would argue, on this form, that it's a little bit ununderstandable. I really, I think there's some of me that submits to the sunken cost argument. There's some of me that submits to that it's really, that portion of it, I think, is the finer details of the contract, and the negotiation of the tuition agreement. And I think I would like to ask that we get some input on that, because I think that we're looking at this as this is the tuition agreement and this is all that it is, and that every Hill student's going to pay 13.2 or 12.2 or 12.3, I don't know where they're at. And it's not that. This is the tuition agreement that we're hoping to use, or this is the tuition calculator that we're hoping to use going forward into negotiations of that. And I do think that the business administrator specifically has a lot more to add on how that contract would look in that negotiation process. And I think it's fair to ask for that input.
The other significant thing is the business administrator estimated the reduction in school education taxes for the towns, and averages close to 5.5% reduction if the tuition in based on the model that's being presented.
That raises another question relative to, this would start next year, right?
So at the meeting, we talked, it is their hope that it would start next year. We expressed our concern that you would have to have that as a warrant article, and we would have to have a contract negotiated by kind of January, which may be tough to do.
Yeah.
It would take a lot of effort on all of our parts. I don't think it's impossible. But I guess I would also add that, a tuition arrangement is, agreement is not new in the state. There's probably 50 or 60 of them out there to model after. It's not starting from scratch. I want to reiterate what Ben said. This is really a tuition calculator in the sense of this would framework how we would calculate a tuition rate in that agreement. There would be lots of other things in that agreement, such as making sure we didn't all of a sudden have far more students than we were expected. But I do think the board should consider this. It is based on this calculation. It's an $814,000 potential revenue stream for this district to help support potentially things like full-day kindergarten.
Right.
And to move some of those bigger projects that we would like to move forward.
Right. Now, the question I had relative to the fact that this was the next year is we've already done a couple of things and gone forward with some estimates that have proven to be different. We were down $1 million in state aid, then I think it I forget the number, but now we're ahead on state aid estimates.
We're definitely not down $1 million in state aid. That has never been mentioned. We did look at a reduction in adequacy aid of about $100,000, just over $100,000. There's a similar markdown from the prior year. But actually your adequacy aid on some communities increased, so it's just about even. It's a tiny bit up from last year.
Okay, but budgetarily, we are now 179,000 higher than where we thought we were. So my question relates to...
Not $1 million, right.
Thank you for correcting that. The 179,000 that we now have in addition to the budget we already approved, do we go back and redo the budget?
So the board can't do that, but the budget committee, so we gave those numbers to the budget committee, who has chosen to add back in the repairs to the roof and the gym floors at the middle and the high school. So those were two things the budget committee voted to put back in, knowing that the tax cap, we were still far within, I think we're still about $70,000 under the tax cap with that.
Okay, so the agreement we had initially was to put this on the warrant to let the voters decide whether or not that this would be a good idea to bring in this particular district into tuition into ours. But the logistics of this require us to do extraordinary gymnastics in order to get it done in time for them to participate next year. But we can't add the kindergarten next year because we don't want to go too fast on the kindergarten to improve the student outcome. So I have a fundamental problem with trying to push this sort of thing through just for financial beneficiary reasons. 800,000 that now we're going to tax the taxpayers for, but then end up giving back next year. So this approach is very difficult to
That's not true at all.
So I guess I would add,
Excuse me, if we take in 800,000 against a budget that we've already agreed to tax the taxpayers for, whatever the number is, 11.5 million, whatever the number is, that means that we are going to tax them at 800,000 higher than we need to.
No, you're
No,
going to
we
tax them
do.
exactly what you need to
We
cover
would have
that cost.
you'd have a special revenue meeting.
And you'd have a special revenue meeting to reduce the tax rate by that amount, which is approximately, as you heard, a 5%, just a 5.5% reduction in
Okay.
taxes for your taxpayers.
So there is a mechanism to deal with that very
Correct.
issue.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's part of the convoluted approach to...
Complex, maybe not convoluted.
Well, depends on your perspective on this. It's not simple, and we're asking future administrations to be responsible for something that very simply, over the past several years, what was it, 8 years, or 11 years, we had Project Promise?
So I guess let me, if I can step in,
That we found
because
difficult to manage.
I find Project Promise and this totally two different ballgames.
And they are.
One is a grant that reduces, one has lots of things to it. I don't know that you can compare the two.
I'm comparing them from a managerial perspective.
Right, and I would say not even close. Project Promise, somebody oversaw that, there was no rules, no gameplay, no plan. This is a 10-year tuition arrangement that no matter who looks at that agreement can interpret it the same way. It will calculate out exactly what that agreement says. So if I'm not here in 2 years, whoever's the superintendent, whoever's the business administrator would open up that agreement. It would spell out exactly what's considered. The reason this is far easier than any other thing is we already have established programs. We already have 7th and 8th grade. We already have high school. We are not creating something new. We are plugging additional students, about 10 per grade level, into those grades. The biggest issue would be looking at transition and making sure those students from Hill had some nice transition. Other than that, we are really plugging in schedules for them. We already have established programs. All-day kindergarten is establishing a new program. That means reviewing curriculum, that means changing staffing. There's a lot of things that go into play in that two very, very different scenarios.
Thank you
Real
for
quick,
that, Ben.
I think it's fair to add too, so that there's a good understanding that, and I apologize, whatever the number was, 800 some odd $1,000 as an overall revenue is not what you would see the first year, right? That's
Correct.
just the portion of matriculating those students into the Newfound Area School District, you'd have a certain portion of the high school students that would not attend because they choose to fill out their high school careers at Franklin. Just to add that piece, that should we move forward with this, and should we anticipate $800 and some odd thousand the first year?
This is kind of like best case scenario with every student attending next year.
Right, participating.
I guess I could get behind this if the school board and services and officer superintendent services numbers were taken out of the formula. I mean, that's $500,000 worth of money there.
And just so you know, I mean, we had lots of debates and conversations, which is why, do you see that kind of right column, yes or no? You can plug in the calculator, yes or no, and change that number. Because those were things that we wanted to have great conversations around, and we have had 2 meetings where we've had really good dialogue and conversations around should they stay, should they go. And as you see, there's 2 columns, two that were no's, that we said, nope, those should be included in the tuition and not billed separately.
So, School Board Services and Office of the Superintendent, I noticed there are 2 different figures, one for the high school and one for the middle school. Is that the total for the high school that I'm seeing there? The total allotted to the high school?
Yeah, the upper portion is high school only with its own calculator.
So wouldn't,
And the bottom is middle school.
so wouldn't it make sense to just allot the portion, you've got how many kids that would be going to the high school, say it's 40, to give a percentage?
It does that naturally.
As opposed to...
Because we divide it out by only their students.
Yeah, so this is the figure for only theirs?
No, this is the figure for the high school. So you take so for example, Office of Superintendent Services, $299, the middle school is $158, and then there would be a cost, because it's prorated out for all the schools. And so this is their share based on students. So if you divide this by, 400 students with Hill included, that number goes down. The per pupil cost of that goes down. So it is already if that's included in the tuition rate, it's already a proportionate share that they would pay.
Oh, so they wouldn't be...
They're not paying that entire dollar amount. They're paying it proportionately to,
We're just subtracting the entire dollar amount.
from the entire budget.
From the calculator, from the division of the number of students.
So what do pulling those 2 items out do to the number?
Brings it over 14,000 per pupil. And this was tough, because when we look at this, we're looking at, there is validity to understanding that this is a sunk cost for the school district. And in the contract, each one of these items that we say yes to, as pulling it out of reducing the overall budget, to say these are costs we're not going to consider, and a base tuition rate, is we address them in what kind of power they have in the district as either a voting member or not. They're not buying into the cooperative. They don't have a seat at your table. So in understanding that, it is a little bit of a compromise on our part, because there's no way we're getting this much over a $13,000 number. And by showing you the assessment and looking at, is this a fair number? Are your taxpayers paying more than $13,000 on average per student to go here? They're not. So we wanted to really look at that and look at the current billing and say, is this, based on our current numbers, a fair rate to even offer you? Because if we can't go in there with the number right around 13,000, we lose this opportunity, which might happen. But for looking at this from a cost level, they don't have representation, they don't, and they're also incurring these same costs through their existing SAU. So it's like them paying twice for these kinds of services. And while you make a rational argument, that might be right, but you have to ask yourself, is it fair? And to lose their business, as a group, we had to say, that's something we think would be appropriate to pull out of it.
I understand that also there's a requirement to have joint meetings once or twice a year in the RFP or wherever that was in the proposal.
So that would be totally our option and negotiated through a contract. Yeah.
And also, in that contract, we could include that if they cause any additional cost to the school board, in the superintendent services and debt service, that those would then be covered by them.
It doesn't matter, would it make it into contract, it has to make it in it, because what we're looking at is protecting our capacity, protecting our costs, so that anything, any crazy thing like we talked about, what if a spaceship landed in Hill and dropped off 200 new students? We have to be ready to build according to that, or the contract would be invalid. So those kinds of safeguards need to be built into this. By providing a tuition, calculator like this, it's basically getting us a foot in the door to negotiate a contract, and to sit down and go through all this. You're gonna get another opportunity. If they think that this is plausible, then you'll get an opportunity to say, okay, let's review what we've come up with, and is that fair? So I think this is kind of our attempt to get our foot in the door with good faith, and still justify it by saying, are we being fair to our taxpayers? I think we've proven that, and some of the choices are complex. There's no two ways about it. But I think anyone you hire for any of our positions here should be able to understand a tuition agreement. I had 2 multi-million-dollar tuition agreements. You've had multiple, these are not complex for people that work within these kinds of businesses, and you shouldn't hire anyone that would have a problem with it.
Anyone else? I have a question for Stacy. Is the question under 9J for a second board meeting in December as a result of this possibility?
No, that was really just at the end of the day, did we get everything accomplished, mostly for budget stuff, like did we agree on the warrant articles and things like that we don't have to have another meeting.
Okay.
If this, process-wise, I think Hill is meeting on Wednesday with their board and the public to review all of the proposals. If they choose to go with us as an option, and they are looking to go with just one district to negotiate with them, then it could potentially mean another meeting just to get the okay and move forward with a tuition agreement, unless the board authorizes us tonight that says, if this passes, we have the authority to begin negotiating with them. The committee does.
I was wondering, do we make that motion now?
Which motion is that?
The board votes whether to authorize using this formula.
No, we're going to wait for public input.
No. You need the motion and then ask for the public input.
No, this is discussion first, public input, then we can take action.
So this motion would be to authorize the superintendent to negotiate
The
with
Hill
Hill
subcommittee.
based upon, the subcommittee,
Yeah.
okay, to negotiate based upon this. However, any changes in this would come back to us for our approval or disapproval. Is that what I understand?
So, kind of. So really, we're looking for the board to approve this as the kind of calculator, like how we would calculate tuition, to give Hill an update from our last meeting we had with them. Like, we've met with the board, they're comfortable with this calculation, adding these things that they will get billed separately. And then the Hill board will need to take that information and determine if they want to negotiate with us. At that point, then we would need board approval to begin, for the committee to begin negotiating a tuition arrangement.
And then presumably, as it goes forward from there, that would be the warrant article.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Okay, I think we've pretty well covered this unless anyone would like to continue to discuss it. So, not hearing that, we'll move on to item 9, new business. Speaking of the warrant,
So in your packet is, are the proposed warrants that I have so far. I'm just looking, so We have checked with all of the town halls to make sure we have all the dates and locations and times correct. Article 1 would be to choose your necessary school district officials. Article 2 is your teacher's contract. I would also note you can rearrange these in whatever order you'd like at this point. So Article 2 is your teacher's contract. That's the same language. Article 3 is a question of whether, well, actually, Article 2, if the board would also want, we also had the option of putting in for a special school district meeting, I believe, based on conversations, the board wasn't interested in that, so I did not include that, so, but I just wanted to make sure.
Unless we change that, but.
Right. Article 3, I did put in for the expendable trust fund for the building maintenance to add the $60,000 that you've had consistently on your warrants. And Article 4 is all we have, is the operating budget. The budget committee is scheduled to meet on the 17th, next Wednesday, and we'll hopefully finalize that budget for the budget hearing, which is scheduled for January 9th, Friday night.
Right, Stacy, we already have the votes on all of this except the expendable trust fund, do we not?
No, because you don't have the, so teacher's contract, so what you'll do is, you'll actually vote to recommend it as opposed to, so you've already voted on the contract, you've ratified the contract, but you haven't voted to recommend it. So between either, you can certainly do it at your meeting on the 12th of January because it will be before the warrant actually gets posted. You can make a recommendation of whether you recommend that or not. It's the same as the other, and the budget one you won't know until, you can't recommend or not recommend until after we get that budget committee number. So it's kind of lined up nicely. The budget committee has their hearing on the 9th. They'll meet after that to finalize the budget. You'll meet on Monday and be able to make that recommendation, which will then, everybody will have recommendations on the warrant when they're posted for deliberative session.
Okay, so it looks like we may wait till January.
Yeah, you can do that, yeah.
Okay, does anybody have any additions to the warrant at this point? Any questions?
Subtraction.
Subtract.
And Alexandra is just called the town hall. because
Not
the
the
other
town
buil-
hall?
Yes, no,
Okay.
some people are very sensitive about that. And the other building is called the annex, so they don't
Okay.
have that
We'll
confusion.
take off the old.
Thank you.
Duly noted. So this is more informational at this point.
Yep, or if there's other warrant articles that this board wants to consider to put on there.
There was some discussion, just to be open about it, with a citizen who called and wanted to consider a full-day kindergarten article. And there's some risk in doing that inappropriately, if you will, because if it doesn't pass, then it restricts us for a year. So the wording of any article like that from the floor would have to be done with some precision. And whether or not there's interest amongst the citizenry or not to go forward with that remains to be seen. But there was a follow-up to last month's meeting. Okay, moving on now to item 9B, changes to adequacy aid projections and the adjusted revenue.
So that was kind of what we just talked about, the $170,000 that we received in extra adequacy aid. So we just wanted to update the board because we had talked about it at budget committee, but not at the board level. So which certainly increased the difference between what the tax cap was and what the school board's budget was. So as I noted, the budget committee added back those two items into the budget.
Can you elaborate a little further on the chronology on that and how we were
Can I ask Mike to do
updating
this?
after the fact? Mike?
Yeah, it was essentially 3 days after our meeting in that week that the DOE came out with those numbers. I couldn't put off giving you the budget, so we gave an estimate, just like we did the year before, where we calculate out what we expect that calculation to be. And came within a few $1,000s of it last year. And we expected a similar decrease this year due to caps. But again, it's very difficult to estimate that based on, especially in those communities that will increase because of the type of students and how they calculate it. To evaluate that, it's very difficult. So when we look through it, we want to give you a conservative estimate. We definitely don't want to be below going into the budget committee what we have, so that they end up, or you end up having to cut things that you deliberated over. So, and when we get those estimates from the which, believe it or not, they can still change. This is still an estimate from the DOE. So those numbers can still change.
What would cause it?
Enrollment, student special ed, so the adequacy aid is based on enrollment, special ed students, free and reduced, homeless, there's a lot of numbers that go into that calculation. So if our numbers are way off from whatever it was they estimated our calculation to be, it could influence some of those. They're pretty good about being close to being on target. It was a more significant number because we reduced it based on the enrollment and based on historically what we had been getting. So it made no sense to not include that, especially since we were so close to the tax cap. And it did provide, I think we were $179,000 with that money below the tax cap. So it did offer some opportunity to be able to increase and add some things back in that I know the board struggled with taking out.
And we don't want to just say, well, that's the estimate too. Going into the budget committee, we try to give them the best numbers we have as we have them. So we could have just said, well, that's our estimate. We really don't know. But as your estimates get better and better, it makes sense to give them as accurate a number as possible.
When do you think you'll know?
The actual next year.
Yeah, when they essentially set the rate. So it's just like forecasting oil prices.
Try to guess.
So, I mean, we have all sorts of if any of us were that good at it, I think we'd make a lot of money doing something else. These are fixed things that are fairly difficult to forecast.
Does it not come quarterly when it's adjusted quarterly or something like that?
Not adequacy.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions on it? Okay, we have another item to consider, item 9C, confirmation of budget committee vote to remove the budget committee stipend. This table that we
Yeah, me too.
Why don't you go ahead?
So the budget committee, after
First,
many...
we have to take a quick vote to remove it from the table technically. So, if there's a desire to do that,
I'll make a motion.
Jeff moves to remove it from the table. Is there a second? Seconded by Sue. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. We're now discussing the removal of the budget committee stipend.
So after some lively conversations at the budget committee regarding the stipends and how they're treated, whether they're an employee and have to fill out all the forms of an employee, like an I-9 and all of those forms. This went on for a couple of meetings, and so the budget committee came to terms with, instead of having to continue to have the dialogue, they voted to just remove their stipends, because they're small anyway, and felt that that would have ended the discussion and the debate about how they are treated, whether they're treated as an employee or a contracted provider or whatever it was. And so they voted to not take their stipends. After doing a little research, they don't really have the authority to do that. The school board is the only one who can do that. So after consulting Barrett Christine, he suggested we bring that motion to the board and have them confirm the budget committee's recommendation to remove their stipends. Is that a good summary?
That's a pretty good summary.
Anyone have questions on this?
This was a mutual kind of agreement.
It was a, I think it was a unanimous vote.
No, it wasn't
No,
unanimous.
I think one person did, one or two people.
Two people. It was an act of desperation,
Yeah,
and it was effective.
it resolved the problem.
I wouldn't say entirely, because we've
Because-
had to pay half of that already,
Yeah.
so.
But moving forward,
Okay. We now come to item 9D, which is a request from the Facilities Committee to obtain a third-party 20-year demographic study of the district. This was also tabled at the previous meeting. Is there a motion to take this from the table?
I move that we take this from the table.
Second.
Moved by Dawn, seconded by Jeff. All in favor, say aye. Those opposed? Nay. 5-1. That's Bridgewater in the minority, Leah. No, Bridgewater.
I'm a yes vote.
Yes.
I'm for it,
5-1.
taking it from the table.
Okay, we're going to discuss this. Dawn?
Okay. The reason we're proposing this, that when you cite the state figures, our overall population in the state's going down. But we felt without some specifics as to actual ages, and somebody that had professional experience in projecting out how, for our specific communities, what's going to happen. We couldn't really work with determining our buildings, whether there was adequate capacity and potential uses, such as K through 6, what effect that might have without this information. And Mike, don't you have some basic costs that this might entail?
I think we've seen historically there can run between 4,000 and 5,000. I think you looked at some that ran as high as
40,000,
25,000 and plus. But most of those were consulting fees because they were far out of state. So we're looking at, we believe between $5,000 and $6,000 for a pretty comprehensive study.
I'd like to see the study done. I think we need to give the Facilities Committee the tools they need to work with. While the overall trend in New Hampshire is decreasing school populations, and I don't doubt that's going to continue, I'm a little concerned because there are some communities where they're experiencing an increase in school-age populations. Communities like Manchester and Franklin.
And Danbury this year.
Well, I was just going to get to that. What's happening is the overflow communities from Massachusetts that have low-income support have begun to fill. And what we're seeing, I think, and what I'm afraid we might see, is a second round of spillover from those communities where rural areas having housing at a lower cost, and that combined with lower fuel prices that are going to continue for a couple of years anyway. Now that OPEC has made up their mind that they're going to kill each other. I just want to see somebody who really knows what the numbers are and can come up with some rational reasons why we might not want to do what we do, or that we absolutely should do. I'm not an expert and I don't have a crystal ball. I'd like to get some information from somebody who at least purports to know what they're doing.
Anyone else?
What are we studying? I guess is my question, because it says 20-year demographic study, but then there's some discussion on that we're going to use, that how it's a space needs / usage study, and I guess I would say that if it's solely a 20-year demographic study, I think it's good money in front of that. I think we can look at the numbers solely based on demographics and see where we're going. We can argue until we're blue in the face that we're gonna be one way or the other of that trend. And we're gonna spend, say, $5,000 just for that. Because at the end of it, no matter what the study says, and we see it time and time again, we're gonna argue the outcome of it. We are gonna argue the outcome of it, and the tax base is gonna argue the outcome of it. And it seems strange to me that if it is really an overall space needs usage study, I find it hard to believe that we're gonna get out of that, or that we're gonna get that for $4,000 and $5,000.
For 5 to 6,000 is just a demographic study.
Right.
That's what you'll get out of that.
Sue?
Well, I looked in the town reports for Alexandria for the last, I think it was 4 years, and actually the birth rate went up. They list the births in town. It went up slightly 2 of the years, and it stayed the same the other year. So it's not going down. So I think maybe more study is warranted. Things are not necessarily going that way. Maybe it's just some of our communities, because there are a lot of buildings out there that are selling at a pretty good price, and families can actually afford to buy them. So it's not going the way it's supposed to go.
How do you mean that?
Well, they're saying that we're going to, our population is decreasing. Well, it's not necessarily going the way they say that it's going. We're having these little bubbles in different towns, and does that mean something? And you had the baby boomers, and then you had their children who caused a bubble, and then you had their children who caused a bubble. Are we having another bubble here? Or not? Or is it something else?
It's pretty tough to make some
I would like to-
multi-million-dollar decisions with just hearsay.
Yeah, well, it's also an excuse, in my opinion, to spend taxpayer dollars on a study and then attribute the reason why you're going to make a decision because the study says so. The last study we paid for says that we should have 100 students more than we do in our current student population. So the reason I was opposed from even taking this off the table was because this is a colossal waste of $5,000 or $6,000 of our taxpayers' money, in my opinion. We do not need this. What we need to do is to set everybody down in a room to watch Communities and Consequences and understand that everything in that project that was said 5 years ago has come to fruition, and to make everyone understand the reasons why. And it has fundamentally to do with the lack of availability of workforce housing, people moving from this district to a lower cost of living location in the South and Midwest. It has less to do with
Section
jobs.
8 housing in Bridgewater.
I don't know if you know what's happening in the Midwest. It just came from Colorado. Where 2-bedroom
I
apartments
don't
like $700
appreciate the
grand.
sarcasm,
Well, but,
Superintendent
I
Buckley.
think that,
I think that we all need to respect each other's opinions, and the fact that you're asking to spend more taxpayer money on a study to determine whether or not we need to make decisions, I'm opposed to. So, anyone else?
I would rather,
I think Chris raised her hand.
I just wanted to say that I think input that I've had from taxpayers say that having the third party look at this information is very important and pertinent at this point in time. So I know that has been a conversation that I've had with many taxpayers.
Jeff?
I would rather spend $5,000 or $6,000 in a study with hopefully some good information from somebody who has the time to research facts and numbers than to not spend the money, and 3 years down the road have to spend $500,000 because we made a mistake. Because we didn't see something that somebody else maybe did. I don't want to end up like Franklin, who closed their elementary school and now finds they have to reopen it at a huge cost. You know, I don't think that $6,000 is a lot of money to pay for somebody to do some research and look at what's available for rentals in the area. Look what houses are selling for. Look at how many of the houses are being duplexed. I have a lot of realtors as clients, and the trend in other areas around here is houses are being cut in half and made into duplexes, which then rent. People may not be able to afford a new house, but they can afford to rent an apartment. The people who are sitting on top of the mortgages they can't afford to pay are very quick to split that house in half or in thirds. I would like to see somebody actually look at birth rates and tax rolls and building permits. And I think 20 years might be a little generous. I don't think that they can see that far down the road, but I'd like to see the study, and I think the next 5 to 10 years would be fairly accurate.
Any further comment? Okay, hearing none, we will move on now to item 9E, policy. Yep.
All right, so we had a lengthy policy meeting, and we went through a very tall stack of policies to update from the spring municipal policy update. This list of policies is I'm pretty sure all of them here are strictly changes in legal reference. We did change one regarding the school schedule, but I think that was the last, is that in this list?
Yeah.
School calendar, yes. We changed the school calendar policy to reflect the changes to the teacher contract and starting date. So this is pretty much
Excuse
the
me,
housekeeping
a
list.
question on other items that were tabled at previous meeting needed to be voted on before they were brought up?
That was an error on my part, and at the end of Jeff's explanation, I was going to apologize and ask for a simple vote to take this from the table. I don't think anybody would object to it, frankly, which is why I didn't interrupt. But again, thank you for doing what I asked you to do earlier.
I'll make a motion.
Are you done, Jeff?
Yeah, I'll now make a motion.
Okay. Moved by Jeff to remove from the table and seconded by, was it Ben or Christine? Seconded by Christine. All in favor to take this back from the table, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, the vote is 6-0-0-1.
Okay, if we could just please insert my comments here.
Does anyone have questions about any of these policies? The Policy Committee does a very important piece of work on behalf of the board, and I'm sure you did a thorough job on all of this stuff.
And we'll have another list about this now for the next meeting.
This is quite a long list, so I presume you were able to go through this stuff if you had any questions.
Fortunately, it was legal reference changes that,
I remember the proposed changes, it was just essentially that.
Procedural question, Vincent.
Yes, ma'am.
We would be, any motion would be, what?
This is,
The first read is just read, and then there's no action, and then the second read, or there's a motion to table, or...
well, the way it works is, on the first read of the policy, if this is voted on this evening after public comment, to go ahead with the first read, and that means that at the next meeting, assuming the policy committee presents it for a second read, and we vote to pass it on second read, then it becomes effective with that date of that school board meeting. which gives you another chance to take another look at it, or for anyone in the public who might be concerned to express some concern to their board member or whatever. That's the way the procedure is supposed to work. And it has happened after a first read, things have been referred back to committee. Okay, that allows us to go on to item 9F, which is approval of the June 30th, 2015 retirees request.
So in your packet, you'll see you have I have received two retirement requests for the end of this year. One is Geraldine Dolan, who's a special ed teacher here at the high school, and Cheryl Wilson, who is a first grade teacher at New Hampton Community School. So they both have given me their retirement. They are both eligible for stipends, which are listed on your sheet. And so at the time, the board would just make a motion to accept those retirements.
Okay, moving on to item 9G, which is the delegate assembly representative. Stacy, did you have some comment?
No, just I think Ruby is the delegate, and so she would be going to this. And so but I just wanted to give the board the information on all the resolutions in case you had any feedback for Ruby. So at this, the proposed resolutions will all get voted on by your elected person, which is Ruby, to go to that meeting and kind of put in your vote as the board.
Actually, I believe that I'm the delegate for this.
I looked earlier and it says Ruby.
Did it?
You're the legislative person, but the assembly delegate is Ruby. Yep.
Okay. A couple of things I would like to point out on this. There are 4 resolutions, I think, that are being considered by the School Board Association. One is on page 2 of 10, which is I think more procedural than anything else. Another is on page 4 of 10, which has to do with special ed and funding for special ed. And then the third one is on page 7, which has to do with tuition contract negotiations to be covered under RSA 91A. And their review and analysis on this says that it's particularly timely given the change in enrollment patterns among districts and competition to establish tuition agreements, which is relevant to our Hill discussion. The New Hampshire School Board Association understands the unique and confidential nature of negotiations, whether it is to establish the terms of an employee contract or the terms of agreement and cost for tuitioning students to another district. Strategies involved in the associated proposals should have the same protections and confidentiality. Full disclosure will occur once the tuition contract receives agreement. I thought it was interesting that we have our discussion going on with Hill, and this is coming up in a timely manner as well, which says that there are a lot of districts competing to stay in business of educating their children. So education is indeed a business. The School Board Association is recommending an alternative resolution that is similar in structure. And then there's the fourth one that has to do, which is very interesting, I thought, with changes to the retirement system, making it a defined benefit plan, a defined contribution plan, instead of the currently defined benefit plan. And the School Board Association believes that that's not a good idea because of the potential cost involved in making that change. That's another powder keg. It's going to be a problem for municipalities throughout the country. So. Anyway, if Ruby plans to go, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I'll go confirm with her.
now brings us to item 9H, which is the field trip request, which is the choice of the senior class to go to Lake George, New York overnight. And I noticed about 50 students are going to go with 5 chaperones. Anybody have any comment?
Is there some reason there's no scholarships available?
They did some fundraising, but other than that, it's the senior trip, so I believe they have ample opportunities to do fundraising to make that money. So if students choose not to do fundraising, then obviously it costs them more.
Doesn't our policy require a higher ratio of chaperones to students on an out-of-state overnight trip?
No.
Doesn't.
And 5 chaperones for 50 students is about, at high school, is pretty appropriate.
Senior trip out of state. Yeah.
Any comment? Concerns or issues? Hearing none, we'll move on to our surplus request, item 12I. I'm sorry, 9I.
So in here you have actually 2 lists, they're back to back. One is from the middle school. This is I'll say a pile of stuff that has been at the middle school that I've been asking to get rid of, so we're getting rid of it. So these are old textbooks that, this pile has been there, my understanding is, for several years. So these are textbooks that are no longer none of this is being used anymore. And then on the back is from the business department, mostly technology types of things. So we're looking for board approval to surplus these.
Anyone have any comments or questions on that? Those should be easy. I have chosen not to suggest any of these items go on the consent agenda. That doesn't mean that we can't do that after the fact, but I want to certainly hear public comment on some of these agenda items before we do anything by way of voting. So that brings us to what was item 9J, which is a question of a second board meeting in December. If that was primarily budgetarily related,
Yeah.
perhaps we don't need to do it. The next board meeting would be what, January
12th,
12th?
Monday.
Does anyone see a need for an additional meeting? And a need to pick a date?
I would propose that we